In this episode, we welcome Dien Yuen, the founder of Daylight. Dien is a global leader in philanthropy services, education, and wealth management. As CEO of Daylight Advisors, Dien is working to maximize philanthropy's potential for transforming lives by advancing the training, research, professionalism, and diversity of the advising sector. And with us today is her co-conspirator in advancing the Daylight mission, Tony Macklin, Director of Advisor Practice at Daylight, and our in-house philanthropy geek. Tony helps donors, families, grant makers, and their advisors and associations answer questions about shared purpose, use of resources for social impact, governance, strategy, and assessment. He is a frequent speaker, trainer, and author for those audiences. So Tony Blair once said, the best philanthropy is not just about giving money, but giving leadership. And to me, both Dien and Tony embody this spirit. And I'm so excited to have them here today to talk about Daylight and the 8 trends shaping philanthropic advising. Welcome, Dien and Tony.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's so nice to see you both. I know I get the pleasure of working with you every day, but for our listeners, I'm so thrilled to introduce them to both of you and to Daylight. Before we get into discussing the first trend of philanthropic advising, Dien, can you share a little bit more about Daylight? How did it come to be? What inspired you to create Daylight? And where does Tony fit in?
I would have to say without Tony, Daylight would not have been born. There were some very key individuals that were part, I think, of the founding team. I was teaching at the college. I was also teaching at several universities in Singapore, and then also creating a program for another group in Singapore, and realized that we were talking in very different spaces, but all to advisors. But for some reason, the money, all this money that's stuck inside donor advised funds and private foundations and in the whole nonprofit philanthropy sector wasn't moving as quickly as I thought it should be. I talked to Mike Ray, one of our co-founders, and he and I flew down to meet Isis Kraus, this amazing kind of storyteller, and Isis puts everything, builds beauty out of chaos. We sat down and had tacos. And through that conversation about tacos and how we could change the world, and Mike said, let's daylight this, right? We could figure out how to daylight it. And so that's how Daylight was born. And through that, over the couple of months, we really just sat down and plotted and figured out what was that triggering point? What was that intervention point in how we can move more capital into communities, right? And so over a course, I think about 8 or 9 months, we started putting the business plan together. And so Daylight was born, and we just celebrated our first anniversary, our first year.
Just curious, soft tacos or hard tacos?
Actually, it was hard tacos. We had 3 different types of tacos and beer, IPA beer.
So Tony, she's mentioned how it came to be, and tell me what motivates you about Daylight and what brings you into Daylight.
In October 2022, Dien and I convened 50 philanthropic advisors from a variety of sort of occupational settings and had a session for a day and a half on mapping the future of philanthropic advising. And they built the roadmap for Daylight in some ways. They started to think about, like, what is it the field needs to grow up? Right now, the field of philanthropic advising is sort of a cottage industry. There's not one standard, there's not one training program, there's not one fiduciary responsibility mechanisms, all the rest of it that other fields, even like plumbing, have, like licensing and all the rest of it. And they started laying out 6 or 7 goals of, like, what could it be to grow this field, to really maximize its ability to help donors and foundations move money into all the complex problems in the world. And so that sped me into working with Dien, and then Dien called and said, we're putting this into a firm and actually laying the roadmap down. So it's been fun to jump in and say, how do we take those 50 brilliant minds and put their ideas into action?
It was a very magical moment, I would have to say, in time, because it was after COVID when we could actually come together again after so many years of being on Zoom. And then that bonding, I think, was so important. And then also kind of laid the groundwork for, if we were going to create this, what would it look like? What would be some of the guiding principles? And I think that grounding really helped the trajectory of Daylight. I would say the first thing is always accessibility and equity in all the work that we do. We want to make sure our work is accessible for all advisors. We try and meet people where they are. And then just the equity line that runs through, not just in our curriculum, but in the way we run Daylight, in the way we manage, in the way we treat our vendors and our learners.
Some of the other grounding values will come out in these podcasts, but it really is leaning into where philanthropy is going. The 50 advisors talk so much about how philanthropy had been built on the idea of how do we maximize charitable giving, but they found that donors are real life human beings and we have lots of different ways we make a difference in the world. And so how do we restructure our ability to help donors and families and their advisors think about all the different ways we can have a social impact in the world. And so that lays the groundwork for a much broader version of what philanthropic advising looks like, sort of a more modern practice of it. They also talked a lot about cultural dexterity, and we'll talk about that later as well, of like it's a much more international world. It's a much more international United States. And so we bring lots of new philanthropy and cultural traditions into giving back in the world. And how do we lean into those and learn from them?
So we've talked a lot about how and why, and why it was created, what the principles that guide the creation of Daylight. But what is Daylight? Tell me more about Daylight. What does Daylight do?
We are, first of all, I think, a professional development platform for advisors. And it's all centered around philanthropy and social impact, right? So, Daylight exists to fill a few gaps, I would say, in the sector. We all know there's this great wealth transfer that's happening, right? About 11.9 trillion is going to go into charity within this 10 years. So you have the movement of capital, and then you have a lot of families who are really reflecting about how they could do good in the world, how they can give back and have a higher impact, right, with their work, not just their financial capital, but also their social capital as well. And then you have this next gen and rising gen who thinks, philanthropy and social impact is really important to them. But for some reason, there is this, it's stuck. This whole industry is stuck in this phase where money is just not moving to the communities as fast as it could. And so we looked at why that is. And again, the advisors are the key. There's a lot of research in the space to really has already said, besides, your partner or your spouse, the next biggest influencer is your financial advisor, your accountant, your estate planning attorney. And so for us, our magic moment, I think, is trying to figure out how to work with these advisors so that they could better work with their clients and figure out how to move that, not just by moving the money into communities, but finding purpose, right, in that space as well. And so we train advisors. We build curriculum. We build modern, flexible, scalable curriculum with a very much global perspective. And one of our flagship program is IPA, so the Impact Philanthropy Advisor.
Not to be mistaken for the IPA beer, but the actual IPA certified program. I love that. So one of the things you mentioned is it's for advisors. Define philanthropic advisors, because I feel like it's a bit fragmented. There's the wealth advisors, you've mentioned the financial advisors, but I could be in development in a nonprofit and still value from what Daylight is providing. But can you define what we mean when we say advisors, philanthropic advisors? What's that definition?
This is a hint into the next episode, but really we're looking at philanthropic advisors from a really broad platform. Anybody who's helping donors or businesses think about the who, what, where, why, how, and when of moving money towards social impact. So sometimes they are people who are full-time at that job, philanthropic advisors like I've been. Sometimes they are people who are wealth planners who are also talking about charitable tax deduction. Sometimes they are gift planners at nonprofit organizations who have a chance to get in the ear of donors and help them think bigger picture. Sometimes it's a family therapist or psychologist who has a special interest in working in philanthropy and social impact. Sometimes it's tax people, just anybody who's got a heart for that and wants to help people think bigger picture about their purpose, their legacy, and then how they use those resources to make a difference in the world. So we are open door to anybody who wants to be a philanthropic planner or advisor.
And there's lots of pathways to it, which Dien already mentioned, which is the Certified Impact Philanthropy program. I also know that there's been some significant research that Daylight has done about the philanthropic practice. We won't go into that research today. That's a little bit of a teaser. But I do know that we've done research on the 8 trends of philanthropic advising, which is what we're here to talk about today. So I'm going to jump right in, Tony, and I'm going to ask you to share with our listeners, dun, 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 drum roll, please. What is the first trend in philanthropic advising, and how are we adapting to that trend?
So Dien hinted at this, right? Fundamental to what we're looking at is the changing client base. No matter whether you're a gift planner, wealth planner, whatever hat you wear, the people who are coming into our doors as professionals and people who will be coming into them are more diverse in a whole bunch of different ways. More women are inheritors of wealth and controllers of wealth than used to be. Younger generations are controlling new wealth and creating new wealth. People are creating new wealth with new expectations of wealth, what it can do. You have people who are immigrant entrepreneurs. You have people who are blended families from lots of different ways you can blend families, lots of different identities. And so lots of the old models of charitable planning and philanthropic planning were built by older white guy or traditional couple created the wealth and are sort of managing the wealth and using it in a way that makes a lot of sense to them. But we can't build models for that anymore because we have so many different kinds of donors and donor backgrounds and family dynamic backgrounds and business backgrounds and all the rest of it. So it's a lot about leading into the changing demographics of the United States and eventually the rest of the world as we talk to working on global philanthropy. How do we really help people meet them where they are, where they're coming from in their own cultural identities, and help them mark a path forward?
It's that sort of that cultural dexterity that we've referenced in terms of helping folks gain the confidence and the competence to have those conversations with the awareness of those cultural sensitivities and whatnot. Is that?
I think that's right. And Jen can say more globally, just here in the United States, think about this great transfer of wealth that we're in. Women live longer, so they're starting with some of that generational wealth before it passes on to younger generations. We're finding so often women have new ideas of how they want to use wealth or other resources for philanthropy and social impact. And so they're shifting gears, anything from very famous names like Gates and other folks to day-to-day donors who just like, I have a different way, I want to make a difference and leave a legacy. And then once that wealth gets down to Gen X and Gen Y and all the rest of it, they have new ideas about social impact, much broader ways of doing it. We think about the rising number of families who have different cultural backgrounds. A lot of the philanthropy planning might be rooted in Christian versions of what philanthropy looks like, and that's certainly really useful. But if you go back, even like the number of traditions that are Old Testament based or Muslim or anything else, so like what are the different religious traditions around giving? Where do people bring if they've come from China or Mexico or Canada or Israel or anywhere else? What are they bringing to it? And so you just start peeling back these layers, and cultural dexterity really is that great term of like, how do I help understand where that person's coming from, ask them better questions based in their traditions, or at least open the doors in the right ways that I don't automatically assume how they think about social impact and philanthropy. And so do I have broader sets of questions that get at those sort of what's going on behind the scenes in those donors' brains. It's also beyond cultural dexterity. And again, Dien's more competent in the global piece of it, but it's also just accessibility, right? We are an aging population for the next couple of decades in the United States as we have this baby boomer sort of weeding their way through the United States. And so things like more people who have visual problems or audio problems or mobility problems or other kinds of things. And can we meet them where they are in trying to make a difference in the world versus building philanthropy programs or volunteerism if you're a nonprofit organization that is really for people who are sort of fully mobile. So we have to challenge ourselves to be sure that we're as accessible as possible and slow down when we need to slow down, translate when we need to translate things into audio or sign language or whatever else as much as possible.
There's also this piece of communication, right? Whether you're working with all the different clients, but also different generations. And we have 3 or 4 generations in the same family now. And so when we talk about cultural dexterity, we also include communication, generational issues that come along. You know, like my son is very different in technology, and with his Instagram, it's a whole different culture, right? That I also have to learn. So what we want to do is just create a framework of being curious, asking questions, you know, try and meet the client where they are, help like understand what is important to them and something that they want to keep and cherish, or is this something they want to pivot and maybe leave behind for their future generations? So we just want to create conversation and this respect, right? That you know, culture and tradition and rituals are very important for families. I was going to say in parallel as this is happening, and I would say the individual family and donor client side, on the advisor side, we're also seeing a lot of a market shift as well. So, in the a couple of years ago, it started, but about a 10-year time frame, 37 to 30% of the wealth advisors in the United States are retiring. Right. So this seismic shift is one, creating an opportunity for the younger generation to step into partnership roles and, leadership and executive positions. And then as they're coming into this, they're also realizing that the way that their predecessors were doing business and in the wealth management and planning space is very different because the clients are different now. Right, just as Tony was saying. And so they are trying to reflect in their own practice what the market looks like in philanthropy and social impact, and talking about the different cultural nuances and meeting the clients where they are is becoming so important.
Right.
But the gap is the education. Right? There has not been a lot of professional development programs out there to train wealth advisors in this space. And so I think that's why Daylight is so important. And that's why we love our work, because we're meeting the market where they are, we're training advisors, and the idea then is eventually the social impact, right, will happen. But on the other side, as these advisors are retiring, they're also looking for purpose and impact themselves. Right. So if you retire around 70 years old and people are living to 100, what are you going to do for the next 20, 30 years of your life? And so one of the biggest, research out there is, as they're thinking about this, they themselves want to learn about philanthropy as well. And so I think we are in a perfect time and moment here, right, to make sure all the generations are moving towards that same goal, right, of trying, how do we do good? How do we make the world better?
Well, this has been a great discussion. I've deeply enjoyed learning about the trends, and I know that those trends will trend on in the Impact Philanthropy Advisor Program. So I'm really excited about that. Tony, in closing, please remind our listeners, what is trend one of the 8 trends of philanthropic advising?
So first trend is the changing client base, demographics, kind of identities they bring, and how do you adapt with cultural dexterity and more accessibility to meet those donors and philanthropists and clients where they are.